This is Tom Does Tech. I'm Tom, and in this video we're going to be making this tic-tac-toe game. So you can see here that it says that it's X turn. So we can click in a box and we get an X appear, and then it switches over to O. We can click in a box and then O can go up here and X can go down here. And you can see that now X is the winner. So let's get started making this tic-tac-toe game in React and TypeScript. So I'm here in VS Code and I'm going to bootstrap this application with Next. But you could bootstrap it with whatever you like. You could use Vite or create React app. So I'm going to say yarn create next app, and I'm going to call this TicTacToe, and I'm going to give it the flag of -- TypeScript. If you want to follow along and not use TypeScript, that's fine. You should be able to do that as well. So my next app has finished bootstrapping, so I'm going to cd into TicTacToe. And I'm going to open this up in a new VS Code window. And before we write any code, I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. So I'm going to remove this API folder. And I'm going to come into index. And I'm going to remove everything that is inside main. And I'm just going to say hello. And then I'm also going to remove this footer. And I'm going to change the header TicTacToe by Tom Does Tech. So in the root of the directory, I'm going to create one new folder and I'm going to call this components. And then I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this containers. So the difference between components and containers, as far as I see them, is that containers will hold layout items. So if a component is responsible for layout, it will go in containers. And if it's just a single component that is responsible for displaying one little piece of information, then it will go into components. But the truth is, it doesn't matter, and you do whatever works for you. So inside of containers, I'm going to create one container. I'm going to call this board. And this is going to contain our playing board. And then inside of components, I'm going to create one file. I'm going to call this square. And this is going to represent one single square on the board. So I'm going to come back to the index.tsx and I'm just going to render out the board. And this is of course going to throw an error because board doesn't export anything yet. So we can fix that by coming into board and we create a new function called board. And I'm just going to export that as default. And I'm just going to return a div that says this is the board. So I'm going to split my window so we can see what this app is doing. But first you can run it with yarn dev. So let's define our square component. So I'll say function square. And I'm going to export this, export default square. And in here, I'm just going to return a button that says this is a square. So the first thing that we need to do is to come into our board and create all of our squares. So we'll say const and we'll open up our array brackets and we'll say equals use state. And we're going to call these squares. And we're going to say set squares. And we could come into here and we could create an array of 9 elements like this, but we're programmers and we're lazy. So we're going to say array, and we're going to say we want 9 elements, and then we're going to call .fill, and we're going to fill all of these elements with null. And if I open up the console, I can show you what this will do. So if we say array, and we put 9 elements in, you can see that it creates an empty array that just has a length of 9. But if we want to fill all the elements in that array, we can call .fill, and then we call it with what we want it to fill it with. So by default, you can see it will fill it with undefined, but we want to fill the array with null. So that's how we can make an array with a given length and fill it with something. You can also fill this with, say, 0, or you can fill it with a string value. So the next thing that we need to keep in state is the current player. So I'm just going to say const equals useState. And this is going to be called current player. And we're going to default this to a random value that's either X or 0. So we can add a type for this here. We can say this is going to be either X or O. Sorry, not 0. It's going to be O. So the way that we can create a random value between X and O is we can say math.round. Then we can call math.random. And then we're going to times this random value by 1. And then we're going to say if this equals 1, then set the default value to X. If it doesn't equal 1, it's going to equal 0. So we're going to set the random value to O. So if we print our current player to the screen, we can say current player. And we can say, we put this in p tags and we'll say, hey current player, it's your turn. And you can see here that it defaulted to O. And if we refresh, we get X. And it should just flip between these two evenly. So the last thing that we need to hold in state is the winner. So we can say const equals use state. And this is going to default to null because there's no winner by default. And then we can set winner. So there's a few strategies that we could use to lay out our squares. One strategy would be to say print 9 squares like this. And we could say print all 9 like that. We want these to be in a grid. So you could print a div, and then you could put 3 squares inside that. And you could call this a row, but we can use our array.fill method and print all 9 squares. And then we can use flexGrid to show them in a grid. So let's call array.fill, and we'll make this a length of 9. So we'll fill that with null, and we'll make array a length of 9. And then we'll call .map. And the first parameter of this, we're just going to put into an underscore because we're not going to use it. And we're going to use the second parameter, which is going to be the index. Then I'm going to return a square. And I'm going to set the key equal to the index. And generally this is not advised because if the index changes, we're going to re-render this square or the entire array. But these indexes are not going to change. And so in this case, using the index as the key is generally okay. We're going to pass in an onClick handler. And we're going to pass in a value. And this value is going to be equal to as squares. And we're going to get the index of the current array from our squares. So if we set the index of 0 to an X, for example, the value of this square here, if it's in the 0th position, will be an X. So let's create the function that we're going to pass down. So this function is going to be called set square value. And this is going to take an index. And we're going to pass set square value. And we're going to pass in our index. We're also going to pass our winner down to our square. So we can say winner equals winner. And this is so we can disable the square if there is a winner, but it's unselected. So our set square value, when we click on a square, we're going to set the value of that square to the current player. So if they click on square 8, for example, we're going to set the value of the 8th element in this squares array to the current player. So let's make a new constant called new data. And this equals to squares.map. And this is going to be the value. And then this is going to be the index value of the square. So we can say if index value equals index value. So if the index in this map is equal to the index passed in from this square, then we're going to return current player. Otherwise, we're just going to return the value that's in that square. So now we need to set squares with our new data. And then we need to set the current player to the other player. So if we're on X, then we need to set it to O. And if we're on O, we need to set it to X. So we can say set current player is equal to current player equals X. Then we're going to set it to O. Otherwise, we're going to set it to X. So if the current player is X, then we set it to O. But if the current player is O, then we're going to set it to X. So let's go into our squares. And we have some props being passed in here. So we have a value prop, we have an on-click prop, and we have a winner property. So let's just say if we have no value, we're going to return an empty button. So this button is going to be empty, so we can make it self-closing. And we can say this button is disabled if there is a winner. So we can say winner, but winner is going to be either X or 0 value, and disabled requires a Boolean value. So we can cast winner to a Boolean by passing in Boolean with a capital B, and then we pass winner into our Boolean. And this will cast any value into a Boolean. So if it exists, it will be true. If it doesn't exist, it'll be false. And let's add some types for these properties. So winner is going to be a string or null. Value is going to be a string or null. And onClick is going to be a function that returns a void. And void just means that the function doesn't actually return anything. And you can see that winner and value are two of the same thing. So we can make this a little bit simpler. And we can say type player equals X or O or null. And then both winner and value are types of player. And you can see here now we get our empty squares. So if there is a value, let's say that this is disabled. The button text is going to be the value. And we need to pass our onClick handler into the button that doesn't have a value, so a player can select it. So let's click one of these buttons, and you can see down here that a little tiny O appeared. And now if we click this one at the end, a little tiny X should appear. But this doesn't look very good, and it's quite hard to work with. So let's add some classes to this. So I'm going to add class name equals square. I'm going to add the same class name to this button. But I'm also going to add the player that owns this square as a class as well. So I'm going to add some object brackets, and I'm going to add some templating strings. I'm going to say square and underscore, open up our template. I'm going to say value dot to lowercase. Let's come back to our board, and we'll wrap our board in a div. And I'm going to give our div a class name of grid. So let's come into styles and open up global.css. And let's just remove everything that is in here. And we'll say .grid. And we're going to say display is equal to grid. Then I'm going to say grid gap is 1 pixel. And then I'm going to say grid template columns is equal to repeat. And then I'm going to say 3. And I'm going to say 1 FR. And you can see here that it's now created a grid of 3 by 3. Next, I'm going to say square. And I'm just going to give these a width of 100 pixels. You can make them a little bit bigger if you like. And we want them to be a square, so we're going to give them a height of 100 pixels as well. I'm going to make the font size quite large. I'm going to make it 5 rem. I'm going to make the color, let's make it this E8E5E5. It's a little beigey color. I'm going to give it a border of solid 1 pixels, and I'm going to make this border black. And this is going to apply to each square, so it's also going to look like there's a border around the whole square as well. Then if a square is marked with an O, I'm going to make it green. And then if a square has an X in it, I'm going to make it red. So I'm going to say dot square underscore O. Then I'm going to say background color, and I'm going to use this RGB color here. Then I can say dot square X. I'm going to say background color, and then I'm going to make this crimson. And this is a nice red color. Finally, let's make the text a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to add a P. I'm going to say font size is equal to 2 rem. And that makes it a little bit easier to read. Now we can click and all the squares are filled in. So let's implement a reset button. I'm going to add a button down here, and the text is just going to be reset. I'm going to give it a class name of reset, and I'm going to give it a on-click handler that is going to be reset. Now let's go implement this reset function. So we need to reset our squares. So we can say set squares, and we can just reset them back to this default value here. We need to set winner back to null. And we need to choose a new current player. So let's copy this here, and we can say set current player, and we can choose a new current player. So let's click the reset button, and you can see that it resets it, and we're good to go. So let's go style this reset button so it's a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to say dot reset. I'm going to give it a margin top of 2 pixels, sorry, 2 rem. I'm going to give it a font size of 2 rem. I'm going to give it a background color of aqua. I'm going to say the border is none. A border radius of 6 pixels. Padding of 1 rem. And I'm going to make sure the cursor is a pointer. And this button feels a little bit nicer now. So let's go determine a winner. So if we come back to board, we can make a new function that will determine a winner. So we're going to say function calculate winner. And this is going to take all of our squares in as props. And these are all of our possible winnings. So you can either have a winning by going straight across the first row, straight across the second row, straight across the third, or you can go diagonal down the board from top right to bottom, top left to bottom right. And these are the other possible combinations. So we're going to loop through our lines. So we're going to say let I equals 0. And we're going to say while I is equal to lines.length. Then we're going to increase the value of I. And then we're going to get the 3 properties from each of our lines. So we're going to say lines I, and we're going to say A, B, and C. So we're going to say if squares A and squares A equals squares B, and squares A equals squares B, squares C, then we have a winner. So this is saying if there is a item in the first item, and then the first item equals the second item, and then the third item equals and then the second item equals the third item, then we have a winner. So if that's the case, we're going to return whatever is in square A. Otherwise, we're just going to return null. And this function here can be abstracted out and doesn't need to be in our component. So to type squares, we can type our player, and we're just going to say this is an array of players. And let's type our index here, and this is of course just going to be a number. So every time somebody clicks a square, we need to determine if there was a winner. So let's use effect. And we'll say const w equals calculate winner, and we'll pass in our squares. And we'll say if there is a winner, we're going to set the winner, and that's going to be equal to w. And then we need to see if all the squares are taken up, but there is no winner. So we can say that both players won. So let's say if not w and not squares dot filter. And we can say square. And we can say not square dot length. So this is seeing if we have any squares that don't have a current player in it. And if we don't have any squares, but we also don't have a winner, it means that all the squares are taken, but we have no winner. So we need to set a winner here. And this can just be both. So you can see that TypeScript doesn't like this here, and that's because it's trying to set type of X and O is not assignable to type set state parameter. So let's change the property of set winner. And we have our player type here. So we can say that winner is going to be a type of player. And now that of course doesn't like the type both. So let's say a player can be any of these. But now square doesn't like our player, and that's because we have two different player types defined. We just need to define both in here. Of course, if you're looking to put this application in your portfolio, you'll want to extract this player type and not declare it twice. So the last thing to do is to print the winner if we have one. So we can say if winner, and we'll say congratulations to that winner. However, if the winner is both, we want to say congratulations, you are both winners. So we'll say congratulations, you're both winners. And winner is equal to both. And we'll say, and we'll do the opposite here. Winner is not equal to both. So let's test this out. So I'll put an X here, I'll put an O up here, X here, put an O here, and an X here, and it says, congratulations, X. But it also says, hey, O, it's your turn. So let's conditionally render this, and we'll say not winner. Then we'll render that. And you can see, congratulations, X. Let's reset this. And that is how you can create a TicTacToe game in React and TypeScript. As always, you can find the repository on GitHub. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Make sure you like the video and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.